right, we are live. What's up, my cool cats and kittens? My name is Victor Labrada. I am one of the pastors at Kendall Presbyterian Church, and this is Build Spiritual Immunity, or Building Your Spiritual Immunity. There's my cute little graphic there in the corner. I spent a lot of time on that. And tonight, we're going to do something a little different. Well, actually not a little different, but we're going to take a break from the trajectory we were on. We were going over last week kind of the history of how we got to our current secular age, or why it is that it seems like everybody in the past in Western Europe believed in God and in Jesus and the resurrection and all that. And now it's not just something that seems absurd to a lot of people, but even at best, maybe something that just helps you. You know, it's your truth. If you want to believe Jesus was resurrected, that's good for you. So we just celebrated Easter a couple of days ago, and I wanted to do a special hour on Easter and on the resurrection, because that really is the central claim of Christianity. Even the Apostle Paul himself says, if Christ was not raised from the dead, we are the most to be pitied. It absolutely wrecks Christianity if Jesus was not resurrected. That is, the rest of the Bible could be true. let me say that. Let me get that clear. The rest of the Bible could be completely true. If the resurrection did not happen, there is a big problem in the middle of Christianity. There is no Christianity. We often talk about the crucifixion, and I think modern Christianity, we talk a lot about the crucifixion. And that obviously is very important, and that's the payment for our sins. Jesus took the penalty. But without the resurrection, Jesus was apparently just a really, really good guy, and really, really moral and a good teacher. And a lot of people would agree with that. But for him to be raised from the dead, which the Bible, throughout the scripture, it doesn't just say one person. There's passages about the Father raised Jesus, Jesus raised himself, and the Holy Spirit raised Jesus. So the Trinity, God, raised Jesus from the dead. That's a central claim of Christianity and what has propelled it throughout history. And today, it is one of the most attacked claims, and people will dismiss it out of hand. So what I want to spend the next hour or so doing, and I hope I'm able to get through my copious notes, what I want to spend the next hour doing is building up to why we can believe the resurrection of Jesus is true. Now, let me make a clear statement. You cannot prove scientifically anything that you're not observing. No one is alive right now who observed the resurrection. I have not observed the resurrection. So I'm not claiming to make some kind of scientific argument, and nobody ever has tried to make some scientific argument, because we don't see resurrections happen. It is an incredibly amazing claim, an amazing event. But to require something to be observable for it to be true, or at least observable by somebody measuring, doing the scientific method, would mean that that thing has to happen another time for somebody to observe it. It has to be something reproducible, experimented on in a lab. Now, we can, come to conclusions just based on circumstantial evidence, but if you really, really want to prove anything in history, that thing has to happen twice. So we can't prove in that manner. What we can do is show why it is not an absurd concept, the resurrection, and also why it is not unlikely. And that kind of sounds weird at the beginning, right? But as a disclaimer, I want to say, if you don't believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, if you don't think he was the Son of God, if you don't think he performed miracles, there is not much I can say to convince you. Because even Jesus performed miracles and proved he was the Son of God to his contemporaries. And even he did something like a miniature resurrection. He resurrected his friend Lazarus, brought him back from the dead. A bit later, we'll talk about how that's not really resurrection. That was more of a bringing back from the dead, or resuscitation, really. But he was able to bring someone back from the dead, and the response that his enemies had was not, oh, this guy's a real deal, but rather they started making a plot to kill Jesus. That's in John 11. So I'm not trying to say you're making that plot, but I'm just saying that all the evidence in the world can't convince somebody. God convinces people. The Holy Spirit convinces people. So it's my hope that the beauty of the Christian story, the beauty of the truth found in the Bible makes you want to believe that this is true. Because if you don't want to believe that it's true, then none of this is going to convince you otherwise. But if you want to believe it's true, it is true. The same way that you would want to believe that your loved ones love you. You can want to believe that and it be not true, sure. But you can want to believe that and it also be true. So let us begin. Without further ado, I won't be able to see your comments. Oh, well, hi, John. Hi, Maria. Good to see you guys. I'm going to minimize the Facebook window so I won't be able to see your comments. But we are going to go to the PowerPoint, and this is going to be, forgive me for being a little PowerPoint heavy tonight, but you'll get to see my little face over here, so you won't be too bored. So, the historical case for the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. All right. Now, if you've been on the internet, and I'm sure you have, you've heard people say this, perhaps. Jesus wasn't real. Now, not even that Jesus didn't come back from the dead, but rather that literally Jesus of Nazareth, that Jesus, never existed. That Jesus was a myth, or he's some kind of like just a good little fairy tale for kids, something that his original followers really wished was true or that came out of the Jewish struggle at the time, whatever. Jesus wasn't real. This is properly called Jesus mythicism. I encounter this, and maybe you've encountered this too. It's a belief that Jesus of Nazareth never existed, and he's based on other religious myths. So the source of this, and we're going to analyze some of those myths in a second, the source of this idea is mostly the internet, but of course this idea existed before the internet. There's a few independent film documentaries that have come out in the last maybe 20 years, the most famous of which is Religulous by Bill Maher. He is a very staunch atheist, and self-admittedly not very educated on the subject, but very passionate on the subject. And really a lot of these comparisons can trace themselves to an Egyptologist from the 19th century named Gerald Massey. Now, he studied ancient Egypt. Most of Gerald Massey's theories have been thrown out, discarded. A lot of because it was just disproven. He was trying to tell people that King Herod was actually based on an Egyptian entity known as Herod. And no, we have plenty of proof that King Herod existed, Christian or not. So Massey tried to promote these ideas that Jesus was actually based on other myths. And of course, people were willing to accept these ideas because at the time he was writing, a lot of people were stopping their belief in miracles. People didn't want to believe in miracles anymore. They just wanted to believe in stuff that was scientific, stuff that you could prove. The idea that you could suspend science for any reason was just unfair. It was right out. And it's something I want to say, just at the outset, and we talk about C.S. Lewis a lot, but C.S. Lewis makes a great point about miracles. And that is this. If you do not, I'm going to paraphrase it a lot here. You say you want proof, but then you say that the proof you want cannot include miracles, cannot include the supernatural. So already you've dismissed any proof a Christian could give you, or any idea a Christian could give you. If miracles just cannot happen right out of hand, then there's nothing that I can say that convinces you to believe that a resurrection can happen. Because the resurrection is a miracle. It's the greatest miracle. People don't come back from the dead into a glorified body. That's a miracle. Now, another thing that we can't explain by just science is what's happening right now, your consciousness. All right? Or you have the idea of the evolutionary... I forgot what this... I should have said this beforehand. But basically, the naturalistic argument against evolution, which is this. An evolutionist might say, and I'm not trying to bash on evolution, but somebody might tell you that, well, the reason you believe in religion is because your brain evolved to believe in religions. It's helpful for species to believe in religion. Now, the problem with that argument is that the person making that argument has the same kind of brain you do. Who's to say their brain didn't evolve to believe that? And that they're just evolution's making them believe that religion's false, when in fact it's true. So those kinds of arguments fall upon themselves. there are so many things that we can't explain scientifically, yet we believe. Love, I don't know. Do you really believe that love is just a bunch of chemicals firing off in your brain? It's part of that. But we want to believe it's much more than that. So it's hard to prove these things with tools that were just invented in the last 200 years of the scientific method, which is a great method. Don't get me wrong, one of the best methods. So let's go into just what is a problem with comparing Jesus to these different myths. And this is something you might come across. Whether you're watching a YouTube video and you look in the comment section and your friendly neighborhood atheist is in there just spewing a bunch of stuff about how Jesus is really copying other things. Maybe you learned this in college and you've always wondered about it. Maybe you saw a movie or you just, started putting doubts in your head. So I want to be able to give you a couple of examples here. Let's go to the first one here. The Osiris. So this is the idea that really Jesus is a retelling of the ancient god Osiris. So Osiris is linked to the harvesting rituals along the Nile River in Egypt. So the idea is the cutting down of barley and wheat during harvest is like the death of Osiris. Okay, all right, that's, I guess, a kind of death. While the sprouting of the new shoots, the new crops, well, that's like the resurrection of the farmland. Oh, okay. And his birth was announced by the 3 stars in Orion's belt, kind of like the 3 wise men. All right, we'll stop there. In yoga, that's called a stretch. So this is, you're going to see this kind of motif in a few of these, where very broad comparisons are made, and they're so broad that you can say that about anybody, and really require you to be very poetic with the analogies. So the idea that Osiris predates Jesus, right, an ancient Egyptian god, but that Jesus is a myth based on this. It's very hard to push those things together, but if you really, really want to believe it, I guess you could get somewhere with that. What's our next one? Dionysus, Greek god of wine. So Dionysus is said to have been born of a virgin on December 25th. Actually, no one said that. He turned water into wine. He didn't do that. That was actually from a story that was written in the 2nd or 3rd century, and it was meant to poke fun at Jesus. So that's not something that Jesus copied from Dionysus. People say Dionysus had 12 disciples. Never says 12. He had followers, apparently. Some of them were women that he turned crazy. He's the Greek god of wine, after all. He's depicted riding a mule with palm branches. This one sounds convincing. That's true. He was depicted that way. But that actually was a common practice. That was a way of welcoming a general back after a victory. So it would be like rolling out the red carpet today. So that's not something that would make us think that it's a copy. Also, Dionysus was hanged from a tree. No, that never happened. That idea comes from this the Orpheus amulet, which is an amulet of suspect origin. People want to say it's from the 3rd century, and even then, if it is from the 3rd century, then that's still after Jesus. And also, the amulet's probably from way more recent than that. All right, next, Horus. Okay, I'm going to let Horus explain. We're going to watch a nice little video, and I'm hoping that the audio is going to come through. So let's...
Well, thanks to all of you for coming out to our service this morning, and I pray that the rest of this Christmas day is wonderful for each and every one of you.
Not so fast, preacher man. Behold, it is I, Horus, Egyptian god of the sun, and while you all believe that you've been celebrating the birth of your Lord Jesus, you've really been celebrating the birth of me. For you see, thousands of years before your Jesus came around, I, Horus, was born on December 25th. I, Horus, was born of a virgin. I, Horus, was baptized by a man called Anup the Baptizer, was crucified and was resurrected 3 days later. So you see, your Jesus is nothing more than plagiarized poppycock. And I, Horus, have come to feast upon the sorrow of you foolish Christians.
Yeah, none of the stuff you just said is true.
Yes, it is.
No, there's no reference in Egyptian mythology to Horus being crucified or resurrected 3 days later. There's no documentation anywhere for the existence of a figure named Anup the Baptizer. Horus, his mother, was not a virgin woman, but the goddess Isis, and there is no specific date anywhere tied to the birth of Horus.
I'm pretty sure there is.
Actually, no. All of these claims and many others indicating that early Christians yoinked the mythology of Horus and stuck it on top of Jesus were all completely made up by Gerald Massey, a 19th century cuckoo banana bird self-taught Egyptologist who never provided the slightest shred of evidence for any of these claims and who was laughed out of the room by every serious Egyptologist on the planet. So thank you very much for your attempt to ruin our celebration of Christ's birth, but I'm afraid we're all still having a very Merry Christmas, Horus.
Horus? Did I say my name was Horus? No. What I meant to say was, behold, it is I, Mithras, Roman cultic god of the something. And while you all believe that you've been celebrating the birth of Jesus, you've really been celebrating the birth of me. For you see, I, Mithras, was born of a virgin. I, Mithras, had 12 disciples, and I, Mithras, gave those disciples a meal consisting of my body and my blood. Sound familiar, Christian dummies?
Actually, Mithras was born from a rock, not of a virgin. He had 2 companions, not 12 disciples, and the Mithraic meal was one he shared with the sun god, where they feasted not on his own flesh, but on the flesh of a bull. But even if those claims were true, Christians were already confessing the virgin birth, recognizing the 12 apostles, and celebrating the Lord's Supper before they ever encountered any Mithraic cults. So I'm afraid that you've taken neither the holly nor the jolly out of our Christmas, Mithras.
Oh, you must have misheard me. I'm not Mithras. I'm, Quetzalcoatl, Aztec god of the wind. And while you all think that you've been...
No Christian on the face of the planet ever heard of Quetzalcoatl until the 16th century.
Well, then I'm Balder, Norse god of the...
There were 193 popes before Balder's mythology was actually written down.
Then I'm Horus, Egyptian god of the sun.
You already did that one.
All right, fine. I didn't want to completely humiliate you, but you've left me no choice. I shall now unveil myself to be the ancient deity whose mythology was inarguably stolen by early Christians. Behold, I am...
the ancient Mesopotamian god of judgment. 6,000 years before your Jesus spoke of returning to condemn the lost and resurrect the faithful, my followers proclaimed that I would return to destroy my enemies and raise the dead. So silence your joyful voices, Christians. Your Lord is nothing but a cheap carbon copy of me, the destructor who goes by many names. I am Volguus Zildroha. I am Lord of the Sibulia. I am Gozer the Gozerian.
Gozer the Gozerian is from Ghostbusters.
Dang it, why do so many people still know that movie?
Sing we joyous all together.
I don't understand. If all the things that Gerald Massey said about me were complete fabrications, with no textual evidence whatsoever, why do atheists like Bill Maher reference these claims as if they were true?
Well, Horace, I suppose it is strange that people who insist that they won't believe anything without verifiable evidence are more than willing to believe anything without verifiable evidence, as long as that thing can be used to mock the gospel. But we shouldn't be surprised when people reject proof of Christ's resurrection in favor of demonstrable lies that let them remain in unbelief. After all, Jesus did say, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead.
I said that before Jesus did.
Oh, you absolutely did not!
Okay, that was Lutheran Satire. Great YouTube channel. They've probably seen other videos by them. The one they have on St. Patrick and the Trinity heresies is pretty amazing. And all credit to Lutheran Satire. I had nothing to do with that video. But in that video, Horace goes through a few of the different. There's Mithras. I don't know how to pronounce it. The Aztec god. All that to say that so much of the comparisons that are made about Jesus and he was a myth, he didn't really exist, come from really one place, Gerald Massey, and they've all been discredited. to believe that Jesus never existed. I'm not even saying you believe he was the Son of God or a miracle worker or the Messiah or anything. To believe that literally the man did not walk, in Galilee and have followers, and that he wasn't, a real person. That's on par with believing the earth is flat. The ridiculousness of that statement, that the earth is flat. Like, do people actually believe that? There's plenty of people who believe the earth is flat, and there's plenty of people who believe that Jesus never existed. It's unfortunate. There's so much proof that he did, and so much agreement that he did. So we know that it is Jesus was real, not just from the Gospels, not just from the biblical account. If you don't want to accept that, there's also historical accounts. And the historical accounts do talk about more than just his existence. Because someone might say, all right, yeah, Jesus was real, but he wasn't crucified. Like, that's ridiculous. He might have been some teacher guy. Things got way out of hand, and everybody created this story about him. Well, the fact that he was crucified is actually one of the most verifiable facts we have. This is from Josephus, his work called the Antiquities, which is a Jewish history. So Josephus was not a believer. Josephus was a Jew writing on the history of basically first century Judea, the Roman province. And he's writing this in 94 AD. So this would have been 60 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And he would have been talking to people who lived at the time. Now he's talking about something that happened 60 years earlier. At this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. So that is Josephus. Like, Josephus is not, again, he's not a believer, and some of his writings have been kind of messed up a little bit to try to show that he really was a Christian. But if you read the Antiquities, he's clearly not. But he did know this about Jesus, that he was a teacher, he was very virtuous, and he was condemned to die by Pontius Pilate, and he was crucified. And his disciples, they reported that he appeared to, like, his disciples believed that Jesus had resurrected, or at least was appearing to them as alive. And Josephus even says, like, well, maybe he was the Messiah. Maybe this ancient idea of the Messiah, the person who's supposed to rectify things. But either way, his disciples are still around. This is 94 AD, 60 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and he still has people walking around calling themselves Christians. What other historical writers do we have in this? Well, we have Tacitus, who is a Roman historical writer, writing in the Annals in the year 116 AD. So this is, about 80 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And he's writing about the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. And Nero's persecution. Nero fastened the guilt of the fire, because people were blaming Nero, fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. Extreme penalty was a euphemism for crucifixion. Romans would not even say crucifixion. They would call it the extreme penalty. During the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, or Pontius Pilatus, as his Latin name would have been, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So he's saying here that they were named after Jesus Christ, the Christians, and he suffered a crucifixion under Pilate ultimately, under Tiberius ultimately, and under Pilate specifically. And the mischievous superstition that's being alluded to here is the resurrection. There's no superstition that people are crucified. People would rarely believe that. But their superstition would be the resurrection. He's the Son of God and that came back from the dead. And he's saying, unfortunately, this crazy idea has spread out, not just in Rome, but it's everywhere now. So we have two, and there are actually more historians from the time who write about Jesus and his crucifixion, but those are probably the two most famous ones. Suetonius is another Roman historian who actually gets Jesus' name wrong, calls him Christus. That's not his name, that's his title. Christ is Messiah. But he was known. He was definitely real, and he was definitely crucified. On those two things, historians agree. You will not find a historian who's working at a university or any kind of college or any kind of place that has any kind of pedigree who does not believe that Jesus ever existed. That is, again, on par with believing the earth is flat and trying to teach at a college. They would not let you teach that. No college on earth. The world over. So maybe Jesus was real, and maybe he was crucified, but how do we explain this resurrection? Well, maybe he didn't really die. So we have our next slide here. He's only mostly dead. If you know the movie reference, I'm happy for you. If you don't know it, you're missing out. Go watch Princess Bride. But in that movie, there's a scene where one of the protagonists seems to be dead, and they go to Miracle Max for help. That's Miracle Max there, played by Billy Crystal. And he lets them know, oh, he's not dead. He's only mostly dead. So they can bring him back. And this is an idea that people have proposed that's typically called the swoon hypothesis. Maybe you've heard that, swoon theory. To swoon and to basically pass out. Sorry, I almost swooned into my desk over here. But the swoon hypothesis goes like this, that Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He only appeared to die. And that really he survived that torture. It would be like, sometimes when somebody's executed on the electric chair, they survive. And you can't, punish them again. You already carried out the sentence. So you're a person who survived the electric chair. Great. Now, there's problems with this. You have to consider the actual severity of what Jesus went through. Now, the people who propose this theory, they're thinking of almost exclusively the idea of I could probably hang on a cross for a few hours and live and then pretend to be dead, I guess, or just pass out and wake up later and have enough energy to roll away a stone from a tomb. I can't do that on my best days. But here are some problems with that. Jesus endured severe beatings pre-crucifixion. By the time that Jesus got up on the cross, he was already beat nearly to death. We won't go into gory detail here, but a couple of things to note, and maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't heard this. For one thing, the previous night, we know that Jesus was praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and we're told in the Gospel of Luke that he sweat drops of blood. And that's not poetic, that's actually a condition called hematidrosis. And in hematidrosis, your capillaries burst and you start bleeding through your sweat glands. You can actually sweat blood. It happens. It's not common. It's incredibly rare. But it happens under immense stress. Another effect of hematidrosis is it leaves the skin incredibly sensitive. It would feel like having a sunburn all over your body. The worst sunburn. Because your skin is just irritated all over. So Jesus endures a beating while having that sunburn, so to speak. He receives lashes. He's lashed with a cat of nine tails, which was a gruesome device, which basically was a whip with a bunch of bones and metals that were attached to the end in a frayed end that would dig into the flesh and pull out the flesh. And then they would throw a robe on him, wait until his blood congealed and form scabs, and rip off the robe. They pulled his beard hair out. They did all sorts of things that would be the kinds of things that somebody could die from just from the beating. So Jesus endures a severe beating pre-crucifixion. And crucifixion, it's meant to kill by asphyxiation, not blood loss or trauma. You die on a cross not because it hurts so much, but rather because you can't breathe. You can't breathe. How that works If you would imagine somebody up on a cross with their arms bound. Jesus was likely nailed through the wrists because your palm would have a hard time holding your weight. But either way, he's bound to this cross. His arms are splayed. His chest cavity is forward. His feet are perhaps resting on a little platform on the cross, or perhaps nailed into the cross and resting on a platform. And when you're in that position, in order to breathe, you have to push up on your legs to fill your lungs. Because if you just slouch down, you can only take short breaths. So somebody on a cross would have to keep pushing up to breathe, pushing on all your wounds to keep breathing. Breathing became an incredibly laborious act. It took so much energy out of you that eventually you don't have the energy to breathe. And you drown in your own sweat, your own lack of breath. You're asphyxiated. The Romans had perfected this process. They killed so many people by crucifixion. This was not a new idea. It wasn't a unique idea. It was another Friday. And this method was meant to kill. And the way that they would double make sure that somebody was dead is they'd break your legs. So to speed up the process, centurions would break the legs of the victims, which would keep you from being able to breathe. You can't push off your broken legs. If they wanted to just say, like, okay, we want to, that's a lunch, let's get out of here. But John 19, 33 and 34 tells us that the centurions saw that Jesus was already dead. And remember, these guys are experts in dead. This is what they do literally every day. These are not novices. They saw he was already dead, so they stabbed him in the heart with a spear instead. So that was kind of like, to use crude terminology, that was a double tap. That was the let's make sure, and just in case we get in trouble. So they stabbed him in the heart, and where John tells us that blood and water came out. They pierced a sack of water around Jesus' heart. So we have it on good authority that Jesus actually died. Because if you are actually crucified, which is a widely attested fact, then you were almost guaranteed to die. As far as I know, there are no instances we know of people surviving crucifixion. Now, what adds to this, to why the swoon hypothesis is just can't be true, is if Jesus had survived that, it would have been barely. It would have been barely surviving it. And that would not have been very inspirational. And David Strauss, a theologian from the 20th century, I believe, said this: "It is impossible that a being who had stolen half dead out of the sepulchre, or escaped half dead out of the sepulchre, who crept about weak and ill and wanting medical treatment, could have given the disciples the impression that he was a conqueror over death and the grave, the Prince of Life." All right, think about that for a second. The idea that Jesus had crawled out of a tomb, barely alive, and shows up at the disciples' doorstep, needing medical attention, that the disciples would then be convinced this guy came back from the dead. If that's resurrection, then I don't want to be resurrected. They would have been convinced that Jesus could endure a whole lot, and Jesus could really hang on to dear life. But they would not have been convinced that he conquered death in any way. That's not a conquering. At best, that's like a tie. So, the swoon hypothesis, or that idea that Jesus did not really die, not a lot of people hold that, because most people would rather just not believe he existed. So I have this quote here from famous atheist New Testament scholar, and that sounds weird, right? Who studies the New Testament and doesn't believe in it? Plenty of people. But there's one in particular, his name is Bart Ehrman, and he's received a lot of press. Bart Ehrman used to be an evangelical. He went to Wheaton College, and he had a faith crisis. It had less to do with intellectual doubts and more with just an emotional, traumatic period in his life. And he has taught on the New Testament for decades. He's currently, I think, still at UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he's published a lot of books about how the New Testament's wrong and how Jesus wasn't really who the disciples say he was or who the church says he was. And he engages in a lot of debates. So Bart Ehrman is no Christian. He's an atheist or an agnostic. and he really is not trying to convince anybody that Jesus was the Son of God. But he still says this: the Messiah was supposed to overthrow the enemies, and so if you're going to make up a Messiah, you'd make up a powerful Messiah. You wouldn't make up somebody who was humiliated, tortured, and killed by the enemies, and then killed by the enemies. So Bart Ehrman's point there is, if Jesus is a myth, if Jesus is something made up by his disciples, why would you create a myth of a God who dies like that? A God who's humiliated, dies the most humiliating way. He's executed like a criminal. And if you're going to let's say Jesus is real, the people really think he's the Messiah. If they're going to make up stories about him, why would they make up the crucifixion story? Why not have him die in battle? Why don't make up a story about how Jesus was in a fist fight with the head Pharisee, and they both tumbled off a mountain ledge, and Jesus was never seen again until 3 days later when he appeared. They could have had so many different ways of presenting Jesus as some kind of mythical hero with a mythical death inspiring to all, but instead they humiliated him, they tortured him, they killed him. Why would you write that? Why would you want that to be your legacy? The only reason that would be your legacy is if it really happened. So now we're getting to the resurrection. We have to build up to that. Okay, so that all happened, but the idea of the resurrection, maybe that came much later. This is the next kind of what's the word, contention people will have, or opposition. The idea came much later. So Jesus really died, and then his disciples maybe thought he came back to life, whatever, but that wasn't really cemented, that idea of Jesus came back from the dead, until later on, because they really needed to sweeten the deal of, why should you follow our rabbi? Why should you follow our guy? Oh, well, because he came back from the dead. There's problems with this too. The biblical concept of resurrection is not coming back from the dead like a zombie, or being a ghost, or even coming back to life and then eventually dying again. The disciples did not believe that Jesus just came back from the dead. They believed in the glorified body. And we won't go into too much into this concept right now, but the idea of resurrection was around back then. The Pharisees believed it. The idea that at the very end of time, God would resurrect the righteous to be with him. So that was the belief of the Jewish people. Not all Jewish people. The Sadducees, who you read about in the Gospels, they didn't believe that. And that's why they were sad, you see. I remember that joke from like when I was 10. But the Sadducees didn't believe it. The Pharisees did believe it. But the idea that an individual would come back, that was unheard of. That was a new concept among Jewish people. And the idea of resurrection in general was a brand new concept to Greeks, Romans, to people who weren't part of the Jewish community. But the biblical concept of resurrection is not zombie Jesus, or it's not ghost Jesus either, or it's not Jesus comes back and then dies later. And this is an important distinction to make here, because this is really why we believe the resurrection. It's not that we believe the resurrection because it makes Jesus look awesome. It does. But we believe that the resurrection is a precursor to what will happen to every believer. That every believer will be resurrected into glorified bodies to live in those bodies forever. You can find this in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15. That's a lot of our teaching on the resurrection comes from that. And that idea is this, that you do not live for eternity as a disembodied spirit. You're not playing a harp on a cloud. You actually, your soul and your body are reunited. Now, even if, let's say, you got cremated, if God can bring people back to life, he can figure out how to make a body for you out of your remains. But you will be in a glorified body. If it's anything like Jesus' body, what that means is you might have indicators of how you lived. Jesus still had his scars. But those scars won't hold power over you. Those scars will mean something else. There will be evidence of God conquering scars. You will want to eat. I don't know if you'll be hungry, but Jesus definitely wanted to eat fish. He asked for broiled fish. He asked to have a meal with his friends. there's no indication in the Bible that we're going to be, ghosts or spirits forever. Any idea like that? That's more of a Gnostic or Greek idea, that you're separated from your body when you die, and then your spirit lives on forever. In Christianity, your body lives on forever. It's resurrected and glorified, and it lives on forever, and it doesn't die again. That means when Jesus resurrected Lazarus, he wasn't resurrecting Lazarus to his glorified body. Lazarus ended up dying at some point later on. He just delayed Lazarus' death. But Jesus never died again. Jesus died on the cross and then never again. The Bible tells us Jesus ascended into heaven, and he sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. Now, I don't know exactly what that looks like, and what does it mean that Jesus in a body is somehow also everywhere, answering everybody's prayers or interceding for everybody. How is he inside and outside of that body constantly? Those are deep theological concepts we're not going to get into tonight. But the point I'm making is, biblical concept of resurrection is way more fleshed out than the idea of somebody just coming back from the dead. Second, well, I just talked about that. I should have done the PowerPoint. I need to rehearse these things, people. That's what I'm trying to say. Resurrection means passing into death, then out of death into a glorified body that will never physically die again. So that when we say resurrection of Jesus and the general resurrection of everyone, of the believers, that is what we're talking about. We're not talking about just coming back from the dead. That is a huge concept. And how do we know that it came immediately? That it was a belief associated with events that actually happened. Well, I'm going to give you a couple of acronyms. These will hopefully be helpful. Hopefully they'll stick. One of them is POW, and the other is WOW. So Jesus' followers claimed the resurrection and believed the resurrection. They claimed it and they believed it. Okay, claimed it. POW. All right, what do we mean by POW? POW. P is for Paul. Paul's teaching on the resurrection. This is Paul writing to the Corinthians. Paul was a contemporary of Jesus. Meaning Paul lived around the same time as Jesus. Paul was not present at the crucifixion. We have no indication that he was. But he was a hunter of Christians. He was a Jewish Pharisee. He did not like the Christians not one bit. Thought they were perverting Judaism. And he was one of the main antagonists of Christianity and became one of its greatest proponents. And this is what Paul communicates to the people of God, to the Corinthians. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance to the Scriptures, that he was then that he appeared to Cephas, that is Peter, then to the 12. The 12 is a shorthand way of saying the disciples. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now, that's just a euphemism for having died. Then he appeared to James, and which James is that? That's James, the brother of Jesus. That's who Paul's referring to. Then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. So, the conversion story of Paul, maybe you're familiar with it, maybe you're not. I'll give you the thumbnail. He's on his way to Damascus to hunt some more Christians, to arrest them. And he has orders from Jerusalem to do so. And he is stopped by a vision. He has a vision of Jesus. And Jesus says, Saul, that was Paul's name before, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And then, of course, Jesus is identifying with his church, with his followers so closely that if you persecute them, it's like you're persecuting Jesus Christ. And then Saul spends some time in recovery and really thinking about what has just happened and the directions that God has given him now. And he goes to more or less study with the apostles in Jerusalem. The apostles, disciples, those terms are used interchangeably. The disciples would later be called the apostles. Apostle just means a sent one, like a messenger. And that is who Paul is referring to there when he says that he received teaching from them. What we believe about this passage, because this is the clearest expression of the gospel in the Bible. If you want somebody like, what is the gospel? Like, what is the detailed, literal gospel? Not the implications of it, not what the gospel means to you, but when people talked about the good news, what were they saying actually? This is what they were saying. This is probably a creed. Paul is probably was told a creed. And this is happening perhaps the year 35 AD. This is almost immediately after the ascension. That Paul was pretty early on in the history of the church. So this could be 35, maybe 40 AD. That Paul receives this teaching. So the New Testament, the way it's written, it was written over the course of many years by many authors. With the letters that we have, they're very hard to date, but many of them seem to come around in the 60s. There's not a whole lot that happened immediately in the moment. People were not, Peter, James, and John were like, wait, we need to write this right now. When the resurrection happened and when Pentecost happened, these things were later written down by people who were interviewing the eyewitnesses. But if this is what Paul received as teaching, that means that one of the earliest creeds of Christianity, one of the earliest statements of faith, included the resurrection. That's one of the first immediate beliefs. So Paul's teaching on the resurrection, so Paul writing that down is an indication that they claimed it. The disciples claimed that this happened. All right. POW, oral tradition. Oral tradition is a seminary term, whatever you want to call it, for the kinds of stories and the kinds of accounts that are given orally. They're related orally. They're not written down. A lot of history actually is from oral tradition. Somebody at some point writes down the stories that everybody's been saying. The idea of writing things down, it's not universal. People, even cultures today, they might memorize songs or they'll memorize a story, and the father will teach the son the story. Then the son will try to tell the story back, and the father will say, no, that's wrong. Say it like this. And then they'll teach the story as accurately as possible. So this is what we mean by oral tradition, because we don't have oral tradition, right? There isn't a recording of somebody saying these things. But we do have this. And this is kind of some detective work. The book of Acts is full of sermons that mention the resurrection. If you read through Acts, the resurrection is typically the sticking point. Like Paul will say something about the resurrection, and people will be like, yeah, whatever, resurrection. The resurrection is all over Acts. But those sermons are clearly summaries. All right? What I'm saying, I'm not saying here that you can't trust Acts. What I am saying is, when Acts was written down by Luke, he was summarizing the sermons. Why? Because you can read any of those sermons in 5 minutes or less. But sermons are not 5 minutes or less. There's even a story of Paul preaching, in the book of Acts, Paul preaching so long that somebody gets bored and falls out of a window. They're sitting on the windowsill and they fall asleep. And then Paul brings that kid back to life. It's a pretty funny story, actually. But people preached a long time. People were used to sitting in here, like they had long attention spans and wasn't much else to do. So you'd listen to somebody teach for quite a while. So the sermons we have in Acts are clearly summaries, which means that they are summaries from people who heard those sermons. From people who were there, they listened, and they said, well, let me summarize for you what was taught in that sermon. And then you have a sermon that takes up only a page. That means there was an oral tradition. That's an indicator that there were people talking about the resurrection for years and years before anything in the New Testament is written. Before anything's actually written down, people are talking about the resurrection. It's part of the original teaching. It's not a new idea. And then the POW, written tradition. All four Gospels. And the earliest Gospel we have is Mark. It's probably around 66 AD. All four Gospels contain an account of the empty tomb as well as Jesus' predictions of his death and resurrection. So the earliest written documents we have about the resurrection, the earliest written documents we have from eyewitnesses or consulting eyewitnesses, Mark was interviewing Peter. That's sometimes people call Mark's Gospel Peter's Gospel. What we know is that they all believe this immediately. They not only did these things contain the stories of the empty tomb and the resurrection, the idea that Jesus was crucified and then they couldn't find him, that he had come back to life, but also that he predicted that much would happen. And here's our summary for Pow. The resurrection was an immediate belief, I would say an immediate and motivating belief for the followers of Jesus. Okay, so that's one thing. That's the Pow. That's the, how do we know the resurrection? Okay, it happens immediately. That it's an immediate belief that comes up. It is not something that is a legend. If it was a legend, then we'd see no indication of it in oral tradition. And the mentions of it that we would see in the Bible would come much later. It would be actually Eusebius and these 2nd century, 3rd century writers talking about resurrection in great detail. But we don't have that. Instead, we have these incredibly early indications of people believing that Jesus was resurrected. So that eliminates for us the idea of a legend that developed over time. It wasn't. And then we also have the testimony in Acts that Jesus appeared to 500 brothers, that Paul's saying, hey, you don't believe me? Ask these 500 people. Now, if you don't believe the Bible, that doesn't, that's not going to grab you, right? Well, here's a second indication that why we can believe the resurrection. Wow. All right. I made this one up, and this doesn't have as good of a ring to it. But willingness of woe. What do I mean by that? The persecution of early Christians, but specifically the willingness of Paul, a known adversary of Christianity, and Jesus' brother James, who didn't believe during Jesus' earthly ministry. Let me back up a second here. You might not have heard that before. Well, let's walk through this for a second. All right, were Jesus' followers persecuted and executed? Yes. We have, I don't have time to put up all the references, but we have non-Christian sources that indicate that these people were hunted down and not liked very much. Emperor Nero probably killed both Paul and Peter. Peter, what we think, he was crucified, and he was crucified upside down. He didn't want to be crucified like Jesus. And Paul was beheaded. We also have indications that Paul made it all the way to Spain. We know that because of church historians in the 1st, 2nd century who would have known the apostles or talked to them. Like, they were young, apostles are old, and they asked them, tell me about Paul. Because in the Bible itself, we don't know what happens to Paul. We don't know if he ever makes it to Spain. Well, we know from church history he did make it to Spain, and he was executed in Rome. So what is that saying then? It's liars make horrible martyrs. If someone is willing to, plenty of people are willing to live for a lie. Plenty of people are perfectly willing to live for a lie. They might know that they don't really believe what they believe, but their community believes it. Maybe their job depends on it. I read an article a few years ago about like agnostic and atheist pastors. Like, that's depressing, but they can't tell people because they'll lose their job and then they can't support their family. That's a horrible situation to be in, but you can live that way. Very few people die that way. Very few people would be willing to die to defend a lie. It's at that point that the truth would come out. At that point, what do you have to lose? Just confess that you've been lying this whole time. Just confess that you never really saw Jesus. The Romans hated this idea. The Jews hated this idea. They wanted to get rid of this idea. So why wouldn't any of them recant or rescind? And if they did, let's say that one of them did, that Paul or Peter at the last second says, you're right, never came back to life. Where's that confession? What an amazing confession to have if you really wanted to destroy Christianity, which the Romans wanted to do for about 300 years. What an amazing confession if the Jewish Pharisees wanted to destroy Christianity, which they did. Why wouldn't they have publicized that? Because it never happened. Because the martyrs died believing that Jesus was resurrected, because they truly believed it. It was not a lie. And the idea that it was a hallucination, that so many people would hallucinate in the same way, is incredibly rare. And I'm not sure what documentation we have of that happening in any other kind of situation, to the point that people would die over something they're not sure might have happened. And also having just these examples. Let me go into these two examples. Paul, we already talked earlier about how he was an adversary and then a proponent of Christianity. That is a huge swing. That is a huge swing to have. The second, actually, I think is more interesting. Jesus, the brother of James. We know that Jesus had a few brothers and sisters. He has 4 named brothers and some unnamed sisters. We know this from Mark chapter 3. You read through Mark, Jesus had family. And his family typically was kind of, they weren't into the whole Messiah thing. They told Jesus, hey, you need to slow down. Hey, come and just have dinner. These people are following you around. This is what we're told in Mark 3. I think even when Jesus is told, the disciples tell Jesus, hey, your family is calling you back. Jesus says, who's my family? Who's my mother? Who are my brothers? Jesus is establishing that his spiritual family is more important to him. But we're told this in the Gospel of John, this specific story. This is something you might have missed. John 7, 1-5. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. This is right after Jesus loses a bunch of followers because he's told them to drink his blood and eat his body. This is after John 6. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, again, let me give you guys a PowerPoint, I'm sorry. His brothers said to him, and again, his brothers are named Joseph, Jude, also really Judas, but people call him Jude because they don't want to confuse it with Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. Simeon, and James. James, the brother of Jesus. So his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. So they're saying to Jesus, hey, they don't like hanging out with Jesus, by the way, you can tell. Like, hey, just go back to Judea. Don't worry about those people that are waiting to kill you. Just go impress your disciples. If you really are going to do this thing, do it openly, make sure everybody sees it. Go show yourself to the world. This is actually a very, brotherly moment here. It's like, okay, Jesus, the Messiah, go do that over there. We don't want to hear about it anymore. For not even his brothers believed in him. Not even Jesus' own, the guys that saw him make all the wine at Cana, the guys who've been listening to his teaching, the guys who should know better than anybody who Jesus is, they didn't even believe in him. Yet somehow James becomes one of the foremost leaders in the early church. James becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. James becomes a big deal. And how did James, the brother of Jesus, go from somebody who wouldn't believe Jesus in person when Jesus was doing his ministry, but somehow after Jesus is arrested and humiliated and crucified, now James wants to be part of this group of believers who think he was resurrected? Well, it must be that Jesus appeared to James, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So what we have here is a historical basis for belief in resurrection. There is no other way to explain the strength of belief, the power in the wow, the willingness of people to suffer woe, willingness of woe to suffer for this. There's no way to explain the early church putting up with persecution other than Jesus was actually resurrected. They had no other skin in the game. They weren't making money off of this. The Catholic Church didn't exist yet. They weren't some, giant organization in the year 60. They had so much to lose. They had everything to lose. So, yes, could it have been that the disciples stole Jesus' body in the middle of the night and threw it into a dump somewhere? That could have happened. That could not explain why they would get inspired to follow Jesus and die for him after that. The likeliest explanation is the one that seems so unlikely. It's the miracle. History cannot claim miracles. Modern day historian cannot claim a miracle because historians can only claim things that probably happened. Because you can't really, you can't prove to me that Julius Caesar ever existed, but he probably existed. So a miracle by definition is something that is very, very rare and usually does not happen and probably doesn't happen, but might happen. Historians cannot go around saying things that might have happened. So modern historians are almost forced to come up with different explanations for the resurrection. But what the Bible tells us is clear, that Jesus was raised again on the third day. We have the witness of the first believers. We have the witness of adversaries who didn't want to believe but did, and who were willing to die for that. How else do you explain that? How else do you explain why they would go to the mat for Jesus? Why they would go to their deaths for Jesus if he wasn't the person he claimed he was, and if he didn't empower the disciples after his resurrection. We know the disciples were scared right after the crucifixion. They were public enemy number one. They were denying Christ. They were hiding. Yet somehow afterwards, there were these men who you can't stop them from talking about Jesus and his resurrection. So thank you for spending this night talking about Jesus with me. It's always a fun topic, the resurrection. There's obviously a lot more that could have been said. But I think for what we are trying to do in these talks is, I'm not trying to give you guys open and shut cases to slam into somebody's face. What I'm trying to do is give you a reason for the hope that you have, or ability to say why you believe this. And the reason you believe this is because God has changed your heart and renewed your mind. Now you can see the truth and hear the truth. But it's not just based on some incredibly odd, out there, impossible thing. It's based on an incredible thing. An incredible thing that has to be true to explain so much history after that. How else do you explain the church? So much more we can talk about that, and I can address some questions next week. But for now, what I'd like to do is finish in prayer and say goodnight to you guys. So let's pray. Glorious Father, thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for the technology we have today to be able to communicate in this way. Lord, I pray for people who are still affected, are being affected, and continually affected by the ongoing pandemic. Lord, I pray for people who are worried about the future, who are worried about right now. Remind us, Lord, that if you could overcome death, if you could destroy death, and if that is a promise for each of your followers, of each believer, if that's a promise for them, let that comfort us. Let that be the greatest comfort to us, Lord, that there is nothing that can destroy us, not even death. And what awaits us all is eternity with you in our resurrected bodies. We thank you for everything you've given us, and we look forward to what is yet to come. In your Son's holy name we pray. Amen. All right. Good night, guys and gals.